What's up, everybody? It's your favorite Sinful Creature's favorite nerd, and today we are talking about Sins of the Wreckers. The Sinful Creature bit is a really good story. I'll save it for a story time with Skullface sometime. Next Wrecker figure we look at, I'll save it for that. Anyway, this is Sins of the Wreckers. This is the, hyped up, highly anticipated follow-up to Last Stand of the Wreckers, which we've already looked at on this channel. It's written and drawn by Nick Roche, and colors by Josh Bertram, and let's see what else. Just additional colors by Joanna LaFuente, letters by Tom B. Long, series edits by John Barber. So this is the paperback edition. I'm sure it'll be collected in an ultimate edition later on. But I was hyped up to read it. I wanted to read it. It's $20. I got mine off Amazon for I think 14. I can't recall. It has, for those who haven't seen me do this type of thing before, we talk about the book, we talk about the story, and we talk about what we feel about the story. So, real quick, it collects the volumes. Pages are nice. Colors and everything. Everything looks good. It's printed extremely well. And then in the back, we have all sorts of pinup art, including this Wrecker spread, which is great. And some Alex Milne stuff, and a Preceptor piece by Guido Guidi that I thought was amazing. Great stuff there. And then in the back at the end we have like some of the stuff that he's been working on and how they kind of came to be, how the story kind of came to be, and some of the character designs and some of the themes. Nature versus nurture, manipulation and influence, dark past and gloomy futures. I'm not sure how this translates. You guys have to decide after you hear the story. And then kind of script breakdowns and character. It's for a soft cover edition of a graphic novel. It's actually pretty jam packed with good stuff. So I do recommend it in that sense. So we're going to talk about the story. It's going to be spoilerific. We're going to go through the entire thing, all 5 books, and then we'll come back for kind of a wrap up. So it opens with one word box saying Prowl has disappeared, which instantly reminds me of Luke Skywalker has vanished, but that's neither here nor there. We get the information that Prowl has disappeared, though, and Cup and RC are looking for him. They're concerned that there might be enemies looking for him, so they break into his office. They find out that he may be chasing down Verity, who was a human character from the last book, and she has made it known to him that she has information about the Autobot war crimes. In the process, RC and Cup trigger some security response on a pre-recorded message from Prowl, who informs them that he is in trouble and requests Springer specifically to be the only Autobot capable of tracking him down. Cup wants to follow his directions. RC disagrees and knocks Cup out so that she can move forward. And she finds Verity very quickly. But before we get there, we're also exposed to the space station debris, which is the base of operations for the Wreckers, where we see Impactor, who has Guzzle in some sort of prison type structure. It's like a box. Roadbuster and Impactor talk a bit about their kind of current situation, and we learn that Springer's body is kind of constantly under surveillance by none other than Hubcap, which seems like a bit of a strange choice, but he's just a new character they decided to introduce. So he's been monitoring Springer and also kind of everything that's been going on in the debris, but he's stationed there in an administrative capacity. Meanwhile, we learn that Verity is in Alaska, I believe, and she's basically being chaperoned by Autobot Stakeout, which is a cool character to see in IDW and kind of take a more front page, so to speak, presence, and he's looking out for her while they fight polar bears or something ridiculous. But the important information that we learn is that Verity is sick, and Stakeout is trying to convince her not to leak the information, because it could jeopardize the, as he describes it, half-peace between Autobots and Decepticons. The first act really culminizes with Springer coming out of his coma and assembling the Wreckers of Guzzle, Impactor, Hubcap, Cup, and Roadbuster, who immediately find their way to Earth and prevent RC from possibly really hurting Verity. The second book opens with our first glimpse at Prowl. So we know that he is in danger. We know that he's been captured. He seems to be stuck in a webbing-like substance, you might say, but he is alive. But back to our heroes, who are kind of trying to figure out where they lie and where their allegiances lie within one another. Now, obviously, the Wreckers are all on the same team, but as far as where RC fits in, where Stakeout and Verity fit in, and that's all pretty interesting stuff, because RC isn't as jaded by good and bad Autobot Decepticon as the rest of them are due to her experiences that we've seen in other books.
But the Wreckers are definitely red badge good, purple badge bad type of group, and there's an interesting dynamic there. So while they're trying to get on the same page, Verity and Stakeout have a moment together, and then a rabbit runs off with a bag holding Equitas, the information she's been keeping. But Autobots jump at the chance to hunt down the rabbit, and within that hunt, come across the old polar bear again, who isn't so ridiculous this time, because he actually is able to transform. And then it's like a Beast Wars onslaught. We're exposed to the idea that there's more to the rabbit. We see whales, we see squids, we see sharks and wolves, and we kind of get the idea of where that's going. Now, in the midst of that madness, Cup goes down again for the count, but he sort of becomes instantly revived in almost a possession type way, and we learn that it's actually Prowl speaking through him. Now, normally I would hate this type of thing, but it actually kind of works given the history of the other IDW books. I'm going to read this one excerpt from it. He says, "I'm not Cup, not right now. I'm Prowl. Now I'm relieved that you've made a recovery, Springer, but there's no time. Springer wants to know what's going on." And Prowl, through Cup, says, "Mind control, a protocol I had placed in Cup's cerebral network to allow me to influence his words and thoughts. Cup required extensive attention following his radiation sickness on Tishichi, whatever that is, remember? Where he killed dozens of Autobots you sent to rescue him. So I had Perceptor install this little extra." Springer says, "Why would you need to?" He says, "Our war was at a critical point, and all my carefully calculated solutions were being ignored. A charismatic figurehead like Cup could get my message across. I needed the Autobots, I needed Prime to listen." Springer asks if they did, and he says the opportunity never arose. "Ultimately, I was forced to use this connection to urge Cup to seal a portal to the dead universe. He was stranded there for 14 billion years, but all existence was saved, so you're welcome." And that's pretty interesting. It gives Cup's missing nature and that whole weird stuff that went on in those other books a little bit more weight. Prowl doesn't know exactly where he is, so he's trying to give little clues to give the rest of the Wreckers an idea of how to get to him, but the connection is eventually severed. With our Autobots chasing down the rabbit, now being exposed to all these other Beast War character types, they of course radio in for help, which brings our main cast of heroes into the mix. Springer is shot down by a wolf claiming that he is Carnivac, which we remember is the Pretender from G1. He says he's the head of Mayhem, a group dedicated to redressing the balance of power by any means necessary. He says, "We have perfected the means to remain utterly hidden from our enemies. Our spark signatures nullified, 100% effective bio-disguises. We could be anyone, anything. We are invisible." He also says something interesting, which is that Springer has been duped, and that everyone who toils under the ruling class of either faction has been corralled away from the truth. Then pretty much a full battle breaks out between the Autobot cast and these beast characters, Tidal Wave and Clawjaw, etc. And only things that we really need to keep track of here is that Guzzle has been infected with some sort of like rage juice, which we'll get back to. The main cast splits up to handle kind of two different objectives, and Roadbuster does some interrogation techniques that Springer isn't absolutely crazy about in order to find out how to get to Prowl, who, interestingly enough, we learned now knows for sure that his captor is connected to these beasts because the Equitas is in his possession. As we move on to issue 3, it's really the exposition dump. And it's fairly heavy-handed, and it's fairly an intense bit of information that you kind of have to digest. But you learn that previously, during the war, Prowl and a character named Mesothelus, not 100% sure on the pronunciation of that, were a bit in cahoots. And they had been working on this weapon called the Decepticon. And it's another one of these Prowl-type situations. It ended up being used for what some of them would have considered to be a greater good, but in the process killed a whole bunch of civilians or non-affiliates. And the intention was for anybody who survived the attack to blame the Decepticons for it. But this one actually gets the better of Prowl's morals and ethics, I guess. It causes a rift between the two of them. But you also learn about this new sort of weapon that Mesothelus has been working on called the Noise Maze, which is like a alternate dimension, kind of used as a prison almost, but it's constant torture. It terrorizes your senses. Now, this becomes important because you also learn that
eventually Prowl intentionally but only seemingly trapped Misopheles into this dimension, which was mainly to hide any traces of him working with Misopheles on these weapons. Of course, it turns out that Misopheles had a way to escape that was already preconceived just in case, like a contingency plan. But that sort of provides the backstories for these two characters. Now, there are a couple other things that are important. When Misopheles returned from this dimension, he basically wanted to become like the next, kind of major Transformer scientist. Looked into previous scientists' research, such as Shockwave, and you sort of learn about what he's been working on. Now, what he's been working on is like an energy that's been called obtentium. And he's also been working on these, what he calls biodisguises, which is where these Beast Wars or Beast-esque Transformers have been coming from. And then the only other thing that we need to be aware of is that he's very proud of this kind of lab-made robot named Osteros. But we'll get back to that later. So let's get back to the modern day, where we realize that Misopheles is now Tarantulas, basically using this biodisguise on himself in the form of a spider. And he basically wants Prowl to join him again because he feels as though he was never as successful and maybe even arguably as happy as he was when he was working with Prowl on these weapons and experiments. Prowl refuses, and that's where the line in the sand is kind of drawn between those two. Now let's catch up with the other characters. Springer, Roadbuster, RC, Verity, Hubcap, they're all basically trapped in that same alternate dimension that terrorizes your senses via Clawjaw. Clawjaw was supposed to take them to Prowl and sort of led them into this trap. Hubcap is able to sort of drown out the effects, which allows Verity to destroy Clawjaw by sort of increasing the effects of this alternate dimension and thus causing his head to explode. But instead of helping the other wreckers, he seems to let all the effects come back to Verity and then picks her up and tells her that she has to be brave. As for Cup, he is with Impactor back on the debris where Impactor is digging up his own grave from when they thought he was dead, and it becomes known that Impactor is well aware of Misopheles and that Misopheles is involved. Not that it's that key to the story, but there is also a kind of tender moment between Carnivac and Stakeout, where Stakeout, from being trapped in the transformation cog of Tidal Wave, is sort of all disfigured, crippled, and torn apart. But they obviously know each other and have a history, and Carnivac seems sympathetic, and Stakeout requests that he not leave him as he dies, and Carnivac stays there with him, which is like just one of those cool moments that I do appreciate in these IDW books. And lastly, we kind of discover this new weapon called the Impetus, which Tarantulas is using as a guilt extracting computer, and has Springer, RC, and Roadbuster imprisoned in Hubcap by his side. So Impetus is first used on Roadbuster, where we learn a lot about Roadbuster. He was a bit of a drill sergeant for like an Autobot academy, but at least in one moment, things kind of went super dark, and he killed a bunch of the new trainees and offered them up to Mortalus, who he thought was speaking to him, but it wasn't Mortalus, it was Tarantulas. We also learn Hubcap's motivations. Hubcap was the one surviving recruit from that massacre, and after Prowl had imprisoned Roadbuster only to shortly release him thereafter with kind of like a slap on the wrist, it sort of sent Hubcap into a rage, which made him prime victim to kind of be sucked into Tarantulas' plans. And we finally get to learn a bit about Verity's sickness, which Tarantulas tells her is an exposure to not only Cybertronian technology, but more specifically the Aquidus computer, which is kind of a strange bit of irony when you think about it. Next on the list for the Impetus is Prowl. However, Prowl fights back and offers up information about Tarantulas' prize, Osteros, and he says that he killed him. Things escalate, and Prowl catches a pretty serious tail whipping until Cup and Impactor teleport the debris into the noise maze, which seems to sacrifice the structural integrity of it. Tarantulas contacts the beasts, which are known as Mayhem, and asks them for assistance by traveling to the noise maze through a portal inside of Tidal Wave. The next bit gets a little bit interesting, where Tarantulas tells Hubcap to broadcast the information from the Aquidus. And Prowl tries to reason with him by basically saying that if he does this, everything is for nothing, because it could very well restart the war. Apparently this gets through to Hubcap,
who instead releases the other Autobots that Tarantulas had captured, Roadbuster, Springer, and RC. And this sort of launches the battle, right? So you have the Autobot forces and the Beasts, or Mayhem, facing off inside of the Noise Maze. The one add-on to that is that Tidal Wave is now trying to, I guess, turn himself inside out to travel through his own portal into the Noise Maze. And with Tarantulas already worried about the debris causing issues inside of it, now you have this huge robot doing the same. Roadbuster, in an attempt to destroy Tarantulas, ends up basically just becoming fodder as Tarantulas shrinks inside of his head and then emerges, blowing apart his upper torso. And on our third front, we have Prowl and Hubcap. And Prowl has his sights on Hubcap, and he feels as though he has to eliminate him to eliminate the potential threat of that information ever getting loose. Hubcap is now knowledgeable about the dirty secrets that Prowl has had to kind of take part in, or felt as though he had to take part in, and he can't have that loose end. But he's having second thoughts. And those second thoughts last just long enough for Impactor to come up and finish the job that he feels as though Prowl should have finished, adding another layer of intricacy to what exactly is going on here, ethically, the greater good sort of situation between the three. It comes down to the old kind of, do you kill one to save a million? Tarantulas begins shrinking the actual place where they are. RC says, you can have too many party tricks, which makes me think that Nick Roche was a bit self-aware here, that maybe it was a little too many twists and turns, but there's still even more to follow. Tarantulas cures Verity just to let Prowl know he could do something Prowl couldn't, while Impactor and Springer go to plant some sort of bomb to blow up the base from within, only to split up shortly thereafter so that Impactor can help the efforts on the other battlefront. Then in another twist, Prowl lets Tarantulas know that it actually wasn't him that killed Osteros, quote-unquote, nor banished Tarantulas to the Noise Maze, but instead it was Impactor in a similar armor, which reminds Tarantulas of Prowl's character and that Prowl doesn't get his hands dirty and therefore wouldn't have been able to kill Osteros. Thus, Osteros must be still around. And eventually he comes to the arguably obvious conclusion that Osteros is Springer, and pretty much immediately turns tail to run and reunite with his prized possession. This basically allows an out for all of the characters that were jammed up with Tarantulas, minus Springer. Now the main challenge are the forces of mayhem, namely Tidal Wave, who's just a huge robot currently punching up the debris and spilling coffins all over the place. But he's taken out by Guzzle, who forces the power source of Tarantulas into his mouth and goes crazy. He transforms into whale mode, and that causes this structural instability that everyone had feared about, forcing the Noise Maze to basically implode. Obviously, the good guys escape aboard the coffinless debris. In the middle of all this, though, is the reunited Osteros, also known as Springer, with Tarantulas, but he is pretty much ignorant to what Tarantulas is trying to tell him because it's so noisy inside that he can't hear what's being said, and they fade to white. Aboard the debris, in another twist, Guzzle pops up behind Cup and Prowl with guns to their heads because he still hasn't forgotten his issues with both of them. Prowl for everything Prowl's done, and Cup because he killed some friends of his back when they all said he was crazy. But Guzzle is quickly laid to rest with a harpoon through the head by old Impactor, doing what Impactor does, which is his duty. Then, in an awfully brief and quick epilogue, we learn that Prowl went back and rescued Springer before the Noise Maze's collapse. Cup and RC return to Earth, and Impactor has joined forces with Mayhem to sort of stand up against being a tool in someone else's war. And the book eventually closes with Verity sitting looking at the northern lights, and that's sort of how this book wraps up. A healthy Verity looking at lights, Impactor with these forces of mayhem, Cup and RC on Earth, Prowl kind of on the outs, and yet in a weird way kind of redeemed, Guzzle dead, Springer alive.
So, I think that it is a good read. I think that it's worth reading. I think that it starts off stronger than it finishes. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there in the beginning, how they introduce some of the Beast Wars stuff and tie that to this character Tarantulas, who kind of becomes interesting, and then his past with Prowl during the war, the stakes, of the drama, that it could reignite the war, and it's kind of only a matter of time before the war sort of has to reignite, right? So there's a lot of good stuff there. There's a lot of juicy stuff there. There's a lot of relationships, especially with Prowl. I love IDW Prowl. Like, he reminds me of Batman. Just, by any means necessary. Like, the ends justify the means. Except Prowl goes even further than Batman in terms of his violence and what he's willing to sacrifice. So I love that character. I do think that maybe it was mistitled, that maybe it should have been called Sins of Prowl. I think that starts to turn people off because it's definitely a Prowl story. And there are other supporting characters, but it's Prowl's arc that ultimately matters. And I think that was a bit of a mismarketing approach to this, because I think it's kind of set people up for failure, or just not failure, it set people up for disappointment rather, early on. Around the third act, we start to dump story. There's a lot of story, and because we're doing flashbacks to kind of integrate this throughout the time frames, there's an awful lot of information that has to get handed down in 5 books. I kind of feel like maybe this should have been a number of books, and I also kind of feel like maybe this shouldn't have had to do anything with the Wreckers at all. Maybe we could have kept it just about Prowl and Tarantulas and their relationship and kind of gone that route. Had Prowl had a way out and all that, I think that would have been more interesting. The Wreckers kind of play the background. Obviously, there's important stuff in there about the Wreckers, specifically Roadblock, I always do that, Roadbuster, which is awesome, and then the Springer stuff, which I'm not crazy about yet. There's room for it to be really good, but I don't think I'm sold on to that yet. After we get this information dump, we kind of move on to the 4th book, which I think does a decent job of stabilizing it, and then in the 5th book, it's just twist after twist, and it starts getting a little too much for my taste. I'm not crazy about the way that it ended. I kind of feel like a lot of it got wrapped up a little too clean. I liked that the guzzle bit, I like how that went down, but a lot of it I felt like seemed at the end a little bit soulless. And that's a bummer. But that being said, I definitely still recommend it. I don't think that it makes as strong statements about the franchise as Last Stand did. And maybe we shouldn't hold it to that standard. That's also fair. But Last Stand of the Wreckers did something that More Than Meets the Eye did, that Death of Superman did, that a lot of great, and people can argue about Death of Superman, but I would argue that it's great, but that a lot of great, or at least impactful, comic books have done throughout time, and that is you take the impossible and you make it possible. What can never happen to Superman? He can never die. Okay, let's kill him. What can never happen within the Transformers franchise? Well, the war can never end. Okay, let's end it. And I think what Last Stand did was it made you question what it meant to be an Autobot. And then thus a Wrecker, and what's the difference there? And for Impactor to walk away from that, like in a flash, like without really explaining the thought process thoroughly of him having to walk away, without that being a tough call, like he stands true to his job on one page, and you turn a page and he's abandoned it. There's a lot of that stuff that doesn't quite work for me. But I'm still curious to see where it goes. I still like it better than a lot of other IDW stuff that I've read as of late. Nick Roche's pencils are tremendous. Josh Bertram's colors are out of this world per usual. And the comic itself has a lot of good extras and worthwhile information to read as a fan, not only of the franchise, but of the books specifically. So, I hope that helps. I hope that you enjoyed it. These videos take an awful lot of time, effort, and energy to do, so I hope that it was worth it on my end. If not, I guess that's ultimately my fault. But yeah, I do recommend that you pick it up. I do recommend it as worth a read. Maybe just pick it up, wait for it to come out in one of these collection books so you're not just spending money for that, because I think it is still worth waiting a few years for. I don't think it's anything that I felt like I had to read it immediately because I was such a fan of the first one and kind of wanted to see where they went with it. After reading it, it's fine. But I don't think it's necessarily worth dropping $20 on that book just to buy it in the Ultimate Edition or the Transformers Collection books later on. I think this does take place after Combiner Wars, which used to be RID, And that book just went down the tubes for me after it became Combiner Wars. So I think it takes place in real time, so to speak, within the IDW universe, but I could be wrong. Either way, if that is the case, I would imagine that it'll be collected in one of these volumes the same way that Last Stand was. So that's how I would suggest you buy it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.